Hi, so here we are at the Australian Army Tank Museum in Puckapunyal, Victoria, about 120 kilometres north of Melbourne, taking a look at some other World War II era vehicles that are in their collection. And this time we're taking a look at the M3 Medium, this time in the configuration in which the British termed the Grant. So we already took a look at the M3 Lee. So the basic configuration of the vehicle is very similar. So what we're talking about here is a medium tank built by the US and supplied to British and Commonwealth forces under lend-lease. It was a tank that the Americans had designed prior to World War II, and which was available to put into rapid volume production, and hence make up the volume of tanks that the Commonwealth forces needed early in the war, as they were fighting the Germans sort of by themselves in North Africa. So this tank, as the Grant, had a different turret to the US pattern turret, which the British called the Lee tank. And so this turret was designed to have the radios relocated into a bustle at the back of the turret, and to also have a lower turret compared to the Lee. So as a result of that, this tank only needed a crew of 6. So the reason we needed a crew of 6 is because we have a turret with a 37mm anti-tank gun. We also have a 75mm gun mounted in a side sponson, and we also have a driver for the vehicle. So that's how the crew is sort of split up: 3 in the turret, including the commander, a driver, and a gunner and a loader for the 75mm, and a driver. So as I mentioned when I was talking about the Lee, the situation at the start of the war was that the US did not have a turret that could take that 75mm gun, which is mounted in a side sponson here, and so they were limited to mounting a 37mm anti-tank gun in that turret. While this tank was being produced in volume to support the British, development and ramp up was going on to get that 75mm gun into a turret and form the M4 Medium or Sherman tank, which was eventually replaced the Grants in service with the British. So this was used by the British in the Western Desert, and it was certainly helped to blunt the Italian and the German attacks in the early part of the campaigns in the desert. And when it came in, it was replacing the tanks that the British had employed, the cruiser tanks, such as the Crusader, which was the Cruiser Mk VI, as well as replacing Matildas and other tanks that the British had deployed in the desert. And that 75mm gun was certainly an effective gun against any armour that the Germans had in North Africa at that time. As the M4 Sherman became available late in 1942, these tanks started to be retired out of British service as well, and were given over to other Commonwealth nations. So Australia got about 1,700 Grant tanks, as well as some Lees, from the British, which formed the backbone of our armoured forces. Though, given the type of vehicle this was, very large, very heavy, it wasn't really suitable for the sort of jungle warfare that Australia was engaged in against the Japanese. And as such, these stayed pretty much in Australia for home defence and for training purposes, while we deployed lighter tanks such as the Stuart and smaller tanks such as the Matilda to support our infantry forces that were fighting the Japanese. So what can we talk about when we talk about this tank? So while it looks a little bit archaic and doesn't look as polished and as well laid out as some of the later war tanks, it was quite a potent weapon when it was introduced. You're talking about 52mm of hull armour, 75mm of turret armour inside that casting. So with that amount of armour, you could resist a lot of the anti-tank weaponry that you'd be encountering on a battlefield. You'd need sort of a 75mm high velocity gun to start penetrating through those types of armour amounts. So about 2,850 of these tanks, M3s, were supplied to the British, who, as I said, deployed them in the Western Desert starting from May 1942 until they started to be replaced by the Shermans when the Shermans came online later in 1943. Now, I'd mentioned when I spoke about the Lee that the Lee used an aero engine to power it along, because there wasn't a suitable truck or locomotive type engine that was available in large volumes. By the time we get to this configuration of the M3, the M3A5 Grant, that aero engine had been replaced. And this particular Grant is fitted with GM diesels, so a similar engine configuration to what was later used in the M4 Sherman. So it's two I6 diesels mounted side by side and eventually coming to a common output shaft. And so that engine, the so-called GM 6046 12-cylinder, developed about 280 kilowatts, which was a little bit less than the aero engine, the R975 that was used in the earlier M3s, but was certainly sufficient to move this tank along at a decent clip. So still had a top speed of about 42 kilometres per hour. So in addition to being supplied to Australia in larger numbers, about 1,700, there are a large number, I think about 900, supplied to Commonwealth forces in India, who employed them in Burma against the Japanese. So it saw extensive use in the theatre over here, both in Australia for training purposes, after it was retired from Commonwealth use in the desert. So again, we're talking about a fairly consistent employment of the basic suspension configuration that the medium tanks in the US used during World War II. So we've got a front drive sprocket with a front-mounted transmission and final drive, 3 sets of double bogies which are bolted onto the side of the vehicle, and a rear idler wheel. Rear engine, that's where the diesels are, back in this part of the vehicle here. So I'll try and get a shot up onto the very tall deck, which is right there. So quite a high tank. You can see here, this is the Grant pattern turret, which is sort of squatter and flatter. And you can think of it as having a bustle in the back for the radios. And right here, we compare it to the Lee, which is higher and doesn't have that bustle. There's the Lee on the right. This is the Grant that we're talking about right now. Interestingly, some cool spare parts. So here is a volute spring. So for those who are wondering, this VVE, or I should say vertical volute suspension we talk about with the Shermans, that's the type of spring that it employs, which is a volute spring, similar to what you might see in your garden shears. There's a spare idler wheel, which is mounted to the back, entrenching tools on the rear deck. So let's wander around and have a look at the side. As I mentioned when I spoke about the Lee, I've left a bit of DNA on that door there when I bashed my head on it. And yes, there is no part of a tank that gives when you hit it with your head, so be careful if you're here at the museum. So this is the rear of that 75mm, the M2 M3 that's mounted into the side sponson. When we look across, we can see the turret basket here, ammunition stowage for the 75. And coming across here, down the other side, a bit of a close-up of that M2 M3, which, as I mentioned, was eventually mounted into a turret for the M4 Sherman. We still have into the hull the space for the fixed forward-firing 30 calibre machine guns, which the Americans designed in, but which the British never used, and the Commonwealth forces never used. I'll just come back across here, get one more look at the front of that Grant turret with the 37mm. And here we are. We can look inside and see the inside of the turret basket with the space for the ready rounds for the 37mm. So this is the M3 Grant, A5 variant, diesel engine powered, that's on static display here at the Australian Army Tank Museum. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you on the next one.